You're a 28-year-old full-stack developer. You've already done the hard part. You learned the stack. You built real projects. You survived debugging sessions that lasted longer than they should have. You dealt with broken deployments, late-night fixes, shifting requirements, and all the chaos that comes with building software in the real world. You are no longer a beginner. You have real experience now. You can actually bring value to a company. And for the first time in your career, a serious opportunity opens in front of you. Not one offer, two, one in Seattle, United States, one in Sydney, Australia, and suddenly your career is no longer just about code. It becomes about geography, about economics, about lifestyle, about what kind of future each city can actually give you, because both options look good. Both are modern cities, both are part of strong economies, both have respected tech industries, both can put a talented developer on a serious career path. So now you're stuck with the kind of decision that sounds exciting from the outside, but becomes much harder the moment you actually try to make it. Which one do you choose? Do you go where the salary is higher? Do you go where the cost of life might feel lighter? Do you choose the city that looks stronger on paper, or the city that feels more balanced in everyday life? Because this decision is not just about your next paycheck. It's about how fast you build savings, how much pressure you feel every month, how quickly you create financial security, how much freedom you'll have in a few years. And that's exactly what makes this comparison so important, because sometimes two careers can look equally attractive from a distance, while producing completely different financial realities once the money starts moving. So in this video, we're going to break it down step by step. If you choose Seattle, what happens to your money? If you choose Sydney, what changes? Same age, same profession, same realistic lifestyle, but two very different outcomes once income, taxes, and living costs begin to interact. And by the end of this comparison, you'll know which city doesn't just pay more, but actually leaves you in the stronger financial position. Let's start with the most obvious thing, income, because this is where almost everyone begins when they compare two jobs. They look at the salary number first, and at first glance, Seattle takes the lead immediately. In Seattle, the base salary for this full stack developer is $130,000 per year. In Sydney, the base salary is $92,144 per year. That is not a small difference. That is a serious gap. It means that before we even get into anything else, the developer in Seattle is already starting from a much higher earnings platform. But salary alone still doesn't tell the full story, because real life income is not always limited to a single paycheck. There are often smaller streams around the main job: freelance work, contract tasks, weekend consulting, occasional side projects. Nothing extreme, nothing unrealistic, just the kind of extra earning a skilled developer might pick up over the course of a year. In Seattle, that side income adds $6,000 per year. In Sydney, it adds $3,544 per year. So when we add those smaller streams to the main salary, total annual income becomes Seattle, $136,000 per year, Sydney, $95,688 per year. And now the difference becomes even easier to feel. This is not just a symbolic lead. Seattle is ahead by more than $40,000 per year. That's the kind of gap people notice. That's the kind of gap that makes one offer feel hard to ignore. But this is also the exact moment where many people make the wrong conclusion, because they stop here. They see the salary advantage and assume the answer is already obvious. And sometimes that works, but many times it doesn't, because gross income is only the first layer. Then taxes arrive, and taxes have a way of changing how attractive a salary really is. So now let's move to the second layer of the comparison: taxes and mandatory deductions. First, income tax. In Seattle, income tax is $21,374 per year. In Sydney, income tax is $22,177 per year. That's an interesting twist already, because on that one line alone, Sydney actually looks slightly worse, at least at first. But the story doesn't end there. Next come broader mandatory contributions. In the United States, Social Security adds $10,404 per year. In Australia, the equivalent contribution is about $1,914 per year. Now, when these categories are combined, total taxes become: Seattle total taxes, $31,778 per year. Sydney total taxes, $24,091 per year. So the overall picture becomes clearer. Seattle earns more. Seattle also pays more. And that's important because it gives the comparison tension. This is the moment when people start wondering whether the bigger income is going to be reduced enough to make Sydney more competitive. So let's answer that. After taxes, the monthly net income becomes: Seattle, $8,000 $4,685 per month. Sydney, $5,966 per month. And now the comparison becomes much more real, because this is not theoretical money anymore. This is not the number recruiters use to impress you. This is the money that actually lands in your account. This is the money you build your life around. This is the number that decides whether rent feels manageable, whether savings feel possible, and whether everyday spending creates stress or flexibility. And at this stage, Seattle still holds a major advantage. Even after heavier taxes, the developer in Seattle is bringing home a much larger monthly amount. That matters, because once the money arrives, the next thing that decides your life is not taxes anymore. It's daily cost, and daily cost is where attractive salaries often start losing their shine. So now we move into the part of the comparison that feels the most personal: monthly living expenses. This is where the spreadsheet turns into real life. This is where cities stop being abstract and start becoming routines. Where you live, what you spend, how much pressure follows you each month. Let's begin with housing, because for most professionals, housing is the biggest expense. And in cities like Seattle and Sydney, it can dominate the entire budget. In Seattle, rent for a realistic one-bedroom apartment outside the city center is $1,965 per month. In Sydney, rent for a similar place is $1,681 per month. So yes, Seattle is more expensive, but the gap is not overwhelming. It's not one of those situations where one city is cheap and the other is impossible. Both are expensive cities. Seattle is just heavier on this line. Now let's add utilities. In Seattle, utilities cost $285 per month. In Sydney, they cost $208 per month. Then internet. In Seattle, internet costs $81 per month. In Sydney, it costs $55 per month. Now combine those components and total housing becomes: Seattle total housing, $2,331 per month. Sydney total housing, $1,944 per month. So Seattle does cost more, but notice something important. The difference is under $400 per month, and that matters, because when people hear Seattle and high salary, they often assume housing will erase the benefit. But at least in this model, it doesn't. Housing is heavier in Seattle, yes, but not heavy enough to neutralize the income lead. Next comes food, and food matters because it reflects something more emotional than rent does. Rent is fixed, food is lifestyle. It reflects rhythm, comfort, habits, and how a city feels when you actually live in it. In Seattle, groceries cost $520 per month. In Sydney, groceries cost $461 per month. That tells us something immediately. Sydney is lighter here. Not dramatically lighter, but meaningfully lighter than eating out. In Seattle, eating out costs $240 per month. In Sydney, it costs $149 per month. Now the contrast gets clearer. Sydney is offering a more affordable rhythm in this category. And when we combine groceries and eating out, total food becomes: Seattle total food, $760 per month. Sydney total food, $610 per month. Again, Seattle is more expensive, but again, the difference is not catastrophic. This is a pattern you start noticing in the comparison. Seattle keeps costing more, but each category is only moderately heavier, while the income lead stays large. That's a very important dynamic, because wealth is not built by having the cheapest city. It's built when the difference in earnings is larger than the difference in spending, and that is exactly what is starting to happen here. Now let's move to transportation, and this is where the comparison gets more interesting, because here, Sydney actually reverses expectations. Public transport in Seattle costs $100 per month. In Sydney, it costs $154 per month. Already, Sydney is higher than fuel and related costs. In Seattle, that adds $90 per month. In Sydney, it adds $57 per month. Now when the two lines are combined, total transportation becomes: Seattle, $190 per month. Sydney, $211 per month. So in this category, Sydney is actually more expensive overall. That matters more than it may seem, because when people compare cities emotionally, they often assume one city will consistently be cheaper in every area. But real life isn't that neat. Some categories move in unexpected directions, and those small reversals matter because they add credibility to the comparison. This is not a fantasy where one country wins every line. It's a real budget structure with trade-offs. Seattle is not magically cheap. Sydney is not automatically lighter in every way, and that makes the final outcome more meaningful. Next is basic lifestyle. This category is smaller, but still useful because it tells us something about the day-to-day quality of life. Gym membership in Seattle costs $82 per month. In Sydney, it costs $75 per month. That puts total lifestyle spending at Seattle, $82 per month. Sydney, $75 per month. This is almost identical, and that's useful because it reminds us that not every category is a battleground. Some parts of life simply don't create a meaningful difference between the two cities. Now, when we combine all the expense categories, total monthly expenses become Seattle, $3,363 per month. Sydney, $2,840 per month. So yes, Seattle is more expensive, that part is true. But now we have enough information to ask the real question. Is Seattle more expensive by enough to cancel its income advantage? And the answer is no, not even close. Because now we can look at what really matters most, what remains after everything is paid. In Seattle, after taxes and expenses, the developer is left with $5,322 per month in disposable income. In Sydney, the developer is left with $3,126 per month. Now stop there for a second, because that is the moment the whole comparison changes shape. This is no longer about which city is cheaper. It is about which city creates more surplus, which city lets you breathe more easily financially, which city gives you a wider margin between what you earn and what your life costs. And here, Seattle is clearly ahead. The difference is over $2,000 per month. Every month. That is not a minor edge. That is not a rounding error. That is the kind of difference that changes the pace of your life. It affects how quickly you build an emergency fund, how aggressively you can invest, how resilient you are when something unexpected happens. This is where financial advantage becomes real, because extra disposable income is not just extra consumption. It is capacity. It is optionality. It is protection. And once a person has more of that every single month, the future starts to look very different. Now let's extend the timeline, because monthly advantage becomes much more powerful when you zoom out. Annual savings in Seattle reach $63,864 per year. Annual savings in Sydney reach $37,512 per year. These savings figures look unusually high because this model treats annual savings as the full leftover amount after taxes and the limited expense categories shown on the dashboard. In other words, it reflects maximum modeled surplus, not a fully detailed real-life budget with every discretionary or unexpected expense included. That is a difference of more than $26,000 per year. And once you see that number, the comparison stops feeling temporary. Now, we're not talking about a few better months. We're talking about a completely different savings trajectory. Over multiple years, that gap compounds into something much bigger. And this dashboard gives us a deeper look at exactly how that happens. First, saving rate. Seattle, 61%. Sydney, 52%. So Seattle is not only producing more dollars, it is also converting a larger share of income into savings. That's powerful, because it means the stronger result is not just caused by earning more, it's also supported by how efficiently that income survives the cost structure. Next, rent burden. Seattle, 23%. Sydney, 28%. This is one of the most revealing numbers in the entire dashboard, because even though Seattle rent is higher in absolute terms, it takes a smaller share of income. That means the developer in Seattle feels the rent less. The city may charge more, but the paycheck absorbs it more comfortably. Then one of the strongest future-oriented metrics in the file, time to save $100,000. Seattle, 1.6 years. Sydney, 2.7 years. That is huge. That is not just a nice detail. That is time. Time is the one thing you never get back. And here, Seattle is effectively buying time. It gets the developer to a major financial milestone much faster. That can mean earlier investment growth, earlier security, earlier leverage in life decisions, and then purchasing power. Seattle, 100. Sydney, 72. This means that once income and cost are weighed together, money stretches further in Seattle's environment. And when you put all of these advanced metrics together, a clear pattern appears. Seattle is not merely paying more, it is creating a stronger wealth building machine. So now we arrive at the final result, and this time the answer is direct. The winner in this comparison is the United States. More specifically, Seattle wins for a 28-year-old full-stack developer, and it wins for the reason that matters most. Not because Seattle is cheap, it isn't. Not because taxes are low, they aren't. Not because life is effortless there, it isn't. Seattle wins because its income power is strong enough to overpower its higher costs. That is the key. Its bigger paychecks survives taxes, survives rent, survives daily life. and still leaves behind a much larger surplus. And that surplus is what creates wealth. That surplus is what creates speed. That surplus is what creates freedom. But of course, numbers are not the only thing people use when choosing a country. Some people will still prefer Sydney for lifestyle, for atmosphere, for work-life balance, for weather, for personal reasons that go beyond money, and that is valid, because choosing where to live is never purely mathematical. But if the question is financial, if the question is about building wealth faster, if the question is about which city leaves more money in your hands after everything is paid, then this comparison gives a very clear answer. Seattle is not the lighter city, it is the stronger financial city. So now the decision becomes personal. If you were the developer in this story, if you had 2 offers, 2 cities, and 2 possible futures in front of you, would you choose Seattle for the stronger numbers and faster wealth building path? Or would you choose Sydney for a different kind of life, even if the financial runway is shorter? Which one would you pick? Let me know in the comments.